Far out beyond the edge of known space where human maps run out of names, an alien world turns slowly beneath its violet sky. Kalindra, a civilization built on silence, on control, on the elegant architecture of grief held perfectly in place. Inside its royal palace, a throne floats above the ground. A queen sits upon it who has not laughed in 3 years. And beside her a child who has not spoken willingly to another living soul since the night her father died. Then a door opens. A human walks in. He drops his presentation notes. His translator drone announces his elevated heart rate to the entire royal court. He makes a joke that gets mistranslated as ceremonial grief pudding. And a little girl who was not supposed to move, moves. What happens next will make an interstellar court forget how to breathe. Part 1, The Man Who Couldn't Lie. The Hall of Resonance was designed to make visitors feel small. Eli Voss figured that out in about 3 seconds. The ceiling arched so high above him that calling it a ceiling felt dishonest. It was more like a private sky. Silver currents moved through the dome overhead, carrying soft waves of light from one end of the chamber to the other. Crystal pillars spiraled upward on both sides of him, their surfaces covered in pale blue symbols that shifted and recorded and remembered. Between the pillars, narrow platforms of polished black stone floated a few inches above the floor, suspended by fields that hummed so quietly they felt like a thought rather than a sound. It was objectively magnificent. It was also the worst possible place to discover that his hands were sweating through his diplomatic gloves. Eli adjusted his grip on the data prism and told himself to breathe. His translator drone, a disc of polished gold no larger than a dinner plate, rotated near his left shoulder and immediately announced to the assembled court of an interstellar monarchy, respiratory irregularity detected. Suggest controlled breathing. Several heads turned. Eli closed his eyes for exactly half a second. Thank you, he thought at the drone. That was incredibly helpful. Gratitude acknowledged. The drone replied out loud in perfect Calendrian. A few of the court attendants exchanged glances. One of them, Eli was fairly certain, was suppressing a smile. He decided to count that as a victory and kept walking. The hall was full. Ministers in layered silver robes stood to either side, their expressions arranged into the careful neutrality of people who had practiced it for years. Military commanders in dark armored collars watched him with the kind of attention that felt like measurement. Scientific advisors wore floating bands of interface light around their wrists, data streams visible only to them. Behind all of them stood the Royal Guard, tall, still, holding spears that were definitely ceremonial in the same way that a lightning strike was weather. Eli had given presentations before. He had defended his dissertation in front of a committee that included his ex-girlfriend and a man who had fallen asleep with his eyes open. He had explained xenobiological mating displays to a panel of funding directors who clearly wished they were somewhere else. He had presented preliminary findings on neural empathy mapping to a room full of skeptical military contractors who kept asking when the research would be useful for combat. He had survived all of it. This, he reminded himself, was simply a scientific presentation, a very important one, delivered before the ruling court of an interstellar monarchy currently balancing grief and political instability and deep suspicion of off-world influence. But scientifically speaking, just a presentation. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a circular dais of white stone, Queen Maris Solvin sat upon a throne that did not quite touch the platform beneath it. The seat hovered inside a ring of faint silver light, elegant, severe, much like the woman upon it. She looked almost human at first glance, the way all Calendrians did. The illusion never held for long. Her ears were long and finely shaped, curving back through hair so pale it caught the chamber light and held it. Features composed with such precision, they seemed sculpted rather than born. Skin the color of winter morning. And her eyes, luminous pale, the kind of pale that made you think of moonlight passing through still water, were already fixed on him. Not studying him exactly. More like filing him. To her right stood Princess Lyran. Eli had been warned about the child for most of the morning. The warnings had been delivered in tones normally reserved for unstable reactor cores and ancient relics of uncertain origin. Do not approach too quickly. Do not address her directly unless she addresses you first. Do not make sudden movements. Do not offer physical contact under any circumstances. Do not. He had assumed they were exaggerating. Palace officials were dramatic by professional necessity. Now seeing the girl standing silent beside her mother, Eli understood that they had not exaggerated. Not even slightly. Lyran was small for her age. 9 years old, he had been told. She wore a pale ceremonial tunic woven with lines of reactive fiber that glimmered faintly when she moved. Her hair was the same pale gold as her mother's. Her ears were long like Maris's, though softer in their curve, giving her face an almost fragile delicacy. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the assembled court, as though the hall and every person in it existed behind glass. No curiosity in her expression, no impatience, no childish restlessness. That absence was more unsettling than any tantrum could have been. A child should not be that still. A child should not look like she had already decided the world wasn't worth watching. Eli adjusted the data prism in his hands and made himself look away. A herald struck the floor with a resonant staff. One clear note rang through the hall and spread invisible circles of blue light across the polished stone. Queen Maris inclined her head by exactly the degree required to acknowledge his existence without suggesting familiarity. Dr. Eli Voss. Her voice was low and carried without effort. It did not echo, and yet it reached every corner. You were invited to Kalindra to present your findings on interspecies emotional adaptation among neural empathic civilizations. You may begin. Eli bowed. He had practiced the motion for an hour the previous evening and still felt like a folding chair attempting elegance. Your Majesty, he straightened. Honored court. The drone translated without embarrassing him. Small miracle. He activated the prism. A lattice of light unfolded above his palm. Rotating models of neural structures expanded into the air between the pillars. Spectral maps bloomed in soft color. Field diagrams opened like flowers made of mathematics. Several scholars leaned forward immediately, and Eli felt something in his chest loosen by a fraction. Scientists? Good. Familiar territory. My research focuses on the way intelligent species process trust after collective trauma. He began, particularly in cases where the neurological architecture is adapted for empathic resonance. He walked as he spoke, slowly letting the projections follow him. Human neural scans appeared beside Kalindrian sensory matrices. Emotional feedback loops rendered in color. The comparison was striking even to him, and he had built the models himself. At a biological level, trust is never abstract. It is chemical, electrical, behavioral. It is learned, but it is also felt. For species whose neural architecture is unusually receptive to ambient emotional patterning, this process is more complex than most models account for. He glanced toward the queen. She listened without interruption. The ministers looked skeptical. The scholars looked hungry. The guards looked ready to spear any sentence they disliked. Reasonable audience. Humans, Eli continued, are not an empathic species in the formal sense. We do not perceive emotional harmonics directly. In fact, many of us struggle to perceive emotions even when another human is crying in front of us. One elderly scholar blinked. Eli lifted a hand. It is not our finest trait. A small stir moved through the court. Not laughter exactly. The distant cousin of laughter. The kind that diplomacy permitted in public. Encouraged, he kept going. However, humans do emit consistent physiological signals tied to emotional states. Heart rhythm variation, skin conductivity shifts, micro-expressions, vocal fluctuation. Under the right conditions, these create stable patterns that an empathic species may interpret as unusually transparent. His display shifted. Two overlapping nervous systems rendered in color floated above the assembled court. The Kalindrian model was elegant, organized, radiating webs of fine light, every thread deliberate, every connection intentional. The human model looked like someone had dropped a bowl of noodles onto a circuit board. In simpler terms, Eli said, standing near a human may feel less like reading a sealed archive and more like being handed a diary with genuinely terrible handwriting. That got actual smiles. Even Queen Maris's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough that Eli nearly lost his place in the presentation entirely. Wonderful, he thought. I'm charming in a death palace. He went on more confident now. He spoke about recovery pathways after collective grief, about the possibility that cross-species interaction could interrupt emotional isolation in ways that same-species interaction sometimes couldn't, about how unfamiliar presence occasionally felt safer than familiar expectation, because an unfamiliar presence carried no memory of who you used to be before the loss. The hall listened. The symbols on the pillars brightened as they recorded his words into living memory. Outside the vast windows behind the throne, the sky of Kylindra shimmered violet and deep gold crowded with air traffic streams and the distant silver arcs of orbital rings. And then Eli made the mistake of trying one more joke. Further research is needed, of course, he said, rotating a model of the human cortex. Preferably research that does not involve my species attempting interplanetary diplomacy through casseroles, because history suggests that ends unpredictably. His translator drone paused. The court paused. Eli frowned at the drone. You did translate casserole, right? The drone answered with complete sincerity. Closest available equivalent ceremonial grief pudding. A sound escaped Eli before he could stop it. Nearly a laugh. That is not remotely the same thing. And in the sudden stillness that followed, something moved. Not a guard, not a scholar, not one of the attendants. Princess Lyran stepped away from her mother's side. It was such a small motion that Eli almost missed it. The reaction it caused was immediate. Two guards straightened. A minister inhaled sharply. Queen Maris did not move at all, which somehow made the moment feel more dangerous than if she had drawn a weapon. Lyran descended from the dais, slow, unhurried. Her pale ceremonial tunic caught the light with each step as she crossed the shining floor, while every eye in the chamber followed her. Her expression had changed. The distant blankness was gone. In its place was something stranger and infinitely more fragile. Attention. Careful searching attention, as though she were listening to a sound no one else could hear. She stopped directly in front of him. Eli looked down at her, then very carefully lowered the prism projection. Princess Lyran stared at him for one long second. Then she threw her arms around him. The data prism slipped from his hand, bounced once on the floating platform, projected a rotating diagram of the human limbic system directly into the stunned silence of the royal court. Eli did not move, did not breathe particularly. His brain, which had spent 10 years analyzing alien neural pathways and cataloging exotic microbial ecosystems on 3 different moons, had apparently decided that none of that experience applied to the current situation. It had simply stopped. An alien princess was hugging him, not politely touching his sleeve, not curiously examining his research jacket, hugging him. Her small arms were wrapped firmly around his waist, her head pressed lightly against his chest, as though this were the most natural thing that had ever happened in the entire history of the galaxy. The court looked like someone had pressed a universal pause button. Eli became aware of 3 things at once. His translator drone had stopped rotating and was hovering in what appeared to be mechanical shock. At least 6 royal guards had shifted their stance and were gripping their energy spears in ways that suggested they were calculating several extremely fast solutions to this problem. And his drop data prism was still projecting a rotating model of the human brain directly above Lyran's head, the glowing cortex spinning peacefully while the rest of the hall quietly ceased to function. Eli cleared his throat, very carefully. "Hello," he said. The drone woke up and translated it. Lyran did not let go. If anything, she held slightly tighter. Eli glanced toward the queen. Queen Maris had risen from her throne. She had not moved otherwise. Her posture remained controlled. Her expression remained composed. But something had shifted behind her pale eyes. Shock lived there. Not anger, not yet. Just shock, the kind that hadn't decided what to become. Eli tried not to make any sudden movements that could accidentally ignite an interplanetary incident. "Well," he murmured quietly to the girl against his chest, "this is unexpected." Lyran tilted her head slightly without releasing him. Her long ears brushed the front of his jacket. "You are loud," she said. The drone translated it clearly across the chamber. Eli blinked. "I apologize." She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her eyes were bright now, focused. The searching quality in them had settled into something more specific. "Not your voice," she said. "Inside." Eli opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded slowly the way a scientist nods when he encounters a data point he doesn't entirely know what to do with. "Ah," he said, "that kind of loud. That kind." Behind him, someone in the court whispered something urgent in Calendrian. Another voice responded sharply. The guards had taken one careful step closer in perfect unison. Eli raised both hands slightly in what he hoped communicated harmless confusion. "I promise I did not plan this." The drone relayed it with flawless clarity. Lyran ignored the entire court. She looked up at him with the focused expression of someone conducting a very serious investigation. "You are not quiet like the others," she said. "Most people have mentioned that," Eli admitted. A smile appeared on her face. Small, fragile, but real. Several members of the court visibly stiffened. One of the royal scholars dropped a data slate. It clattered against the floating platform and spun slowly in the gravitic field. Queen Maris finally stepped down from the dais. The movement was slow and deliberate. Every inch of it carried the full weight of royal authority. Her long ceremonial cloak drifted behind her as the gravitic field adjusted to her stride. The court parted before her without being asked. Eli had the strange impression that the entire hall had begun orbiting the woman walking toward them. She stopped several paces away. For a long moment she said nothing. Her gaze moved from Eli to her daughter, from her daughter back to Eli. She did not appear to be looking at them separately. She was looking at the space between them, at whatever had decided to exist there without her permission. "Release him, Lyran." The command was calm, measured, the kind of voice that had shaped policy across star systems and expected the universe to comply. Lyran did not move. Eli resisted the powerful urge to slowly dissolve into the floor. "I like him," Lyran said simply. The drone announced it to every corner of the chamber. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that had weight. Eli raised one hand slightly. "In fairness," he said carefully, "this is the first time anyone has said that during one of my presentations." The drone translated it. No one reacted for a moment. Then somewhere among the scholars, a laugh escaped before its owner could stop it. And the thing about one laugh in a silent room is that it gives other laughs permission. More followed, suppressed, quickly buried, but present. Even two of the guards looked momentarily uncertain whether they were still supposed to be intimidating. Queen Maris regarded Eli with the focused attention of someone examining a phenomenon they had not previously accounted for. "Dr. Voss," her voice was even, "have you made physical contact with my daughter before this moment?" "Absolutely not." "Did you invite this interaction?" "Not intentionally." Lyran looked up at him. "You told a joke." Eli blinked. "That is true. You are strange," she continued. "Also true." The Queen's gaze narrowed very slightly. "Explain." Eli shifted, carefully aware that Lyran had not released his jacket. She was still holding the fabric in one small fist. Not possessively, just anchored. "My research suggests," he said slowly, "that humans produce unusually strong emotional signals compared to empathic species like the Calendrians. Your daughter may be perceiving those signals more clearly than most." Lyran nodded immediately. "Yes," Eli pointed at her gently. "Scientific confirmation." The drone relayed this with complete seriousness. Several scholars were now very openly interested. Queen Maris held his gaze. "You are suggesting that my daughter approached you because of a neurological resonance." "I am suggesting," Eli replied, "that my species is emotionally noisy, and she may find that easier to hear than signals that are carefully controlled." Lyran tugged his sleeve lightly. "You are warm too." Eli exhaled. "That also happens." The court watched in the collective disbelief. Maris looked at her daughter for a long moment. Something passed through her expression, something that arrived quickly and was controlled just as quickly, tucked behind the composure that lived there. Then she straightened. "Dr. Voss." Her voice returned to its full authority. Yes, Your Majesty. You will remain in the palace. A pause. Until I understand why my daughter, who has not willingly touched another person since the death of her father, has decided to embrace a human scientist in the middle of my court. Eli considered this. That seems scientifically reasonable, he said. Lyron squeezed his arm. Myris turned toward the assembled court. Dr. Voss will be granted temporary residence in the Royal Research Wing. His work will continue under observation. No one argued. No one breathed particularly loudly. Eli looked down at Lyron, still standing beside him, still holding his sleeve. Well, he said quietly, that escalated quickly. Lyron looked pleased. You are staying. Eli looked across the vast chamber, the stunned court, the hovering throne, the most powerful ruler in the system studying him like a complicated equation she hadn't decided whether to solve or delete. He rubbed his forehead. I was supposed to present 3 more slides. The Royal Research Wing of the Calendrian Palace was the kind of place that made every laboratory Eli had ever worked in feel like a slightly organized closet. He understood this within 30 seconds of entering it and immediately decided he liked it very much. Transparent corridors curved through open chambers filled with hovering instruments and softly humming consoles. The walls were made of living crystal that shifted color depending on the data flowing through them. Pale blue for active processing, deep violet for stored memory, warm amber when a researcher moved through a particular emotional state. Entire sections of the laboratory floated at different heights, connected by slow-moving gravity platforms that rose and lowered with patient precision. Above everything stretched a glass dome that revealed the violet sky of Calendra and the distant silver arcs of orbital traffic. Eli stood in the center of it with his hands on his hips. Well, he said quietly, this is absurdly beautiful. His drone floated beside him. Observation acknowledged. Behind him, small footsteps. Of course. Princess Lyron had followed him from the hall, walking through the research wing's entrance corridor, with her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her pale eyes moving across every surface with the specific attention of someone who had never seen these rooms from this angle before. Not curious the way children were usually curious. Careful, deliberate, like she was collecting data and filing it somewhere important. Unlike the stillness she had worn in court here, she seemed alive with something quieter than curiosity and more focused than wonder. Eli watched her for a moment. Most royal children, he said gently, probably spend their time in gardens. Lyron stopped in front of a rotating molecular model drifting between 2 workstations and tilted her head at it. This is better. That, Eli said, is the correct answer. One of the palace researchers standing nearby was pretending to examine a data panel while very obviously watching them. 2 others whispered beside a hovering console. Word had spread. Apparently it traveled quickly in a palace. The human who had been hugged by the princess was now occupying the royal laboratories, and this was considered significant. Eli ignored the audience. He activated one of the research platforms and let a set of floating screens unfold around him, displaying the neurological maps and emotional field readings he had collected during the court presentation. Lyron leaned forward immediately. What is that? A map, Eli said, of how brains behave when people trust each other. She studied it for a moment. It looks messy. Yes, that is because people are messy. He expanded the projection. 2 overlapping patterns of colored energy threads bloomed in the air between them. The blue signals formed elegant, organized structures radiating outward from a stable center in deliberate arcs. Lyron nodded approvingly at the blue. And the red, she asked. Eli paused. Those are human emotions. She stared at the chaotic tangle of red lines crossing and looping through the projection in every direction, several of them visibly contradicting each other. They look broken, she said. Eli rubbed the back of his neck. That is also a valid interpretation. Lyron laughed, soft, light. It moved through the laboratory chamber, and one of the watching researchers fumbled a stylus onto the floor. Humans experience emotional signals in bursts, Eli continued, leaning into the projection. Sudden spikes, unpredictable rhythms, a great deal of interference, very inefficient system overall. Why do you have it? Evolution, he said. And poor planning. She studied the tangled red web again. Then, but I can hear it. Eli raised an eyebrow. Hear what exactly be your signals? She tapped the edge of the glowing projection, not touching the light, just indicating it. They are loud. That matches my working theory, he said. What theory? That humans accidentally broadcast emotions the way a broken transmitter broadcasts radio signals. Constantly, without filter, without direction, just out. Lyran looked impressed. You are a broken radio. Scientifically speaking, he paused. Yes. She laughed again. Behind them, at least 3 palace researchers had given up pretending to work and were openly listening. Eli continued adjusting the projection. Your species evolved to perceive emotional resonance fields with precision. Humans did not evolve to hide theirs. So standing near a human probably feels like standing next to a fire, Laren said. Eli stopped, looked at her. Yes, he said, exactly like that. She considered this. Is it uncomfortable being loud? He thought about it honestly. Sometimes. Most of the time I don't notice. But sometimes when you are in a room full of people who have learned to be very quiet, he paused. It makes you feel like you are doing something wrong just by being there. Lyran was quiet for a moment. Then what do you feel right now? Eli blinked. Right now, yes. He thought about lying, decided against it. Mild scientific curiosity, moderate professional embarrassment, and a growing suspicion that I have accidentally enrolled in some form of royal childcare program I did not apply for. The drone delivered this perfectly. One of the researchers snorted. Lyran looked puzzled. What is childcare? It is when adults attempt to keep children from doing dangerous things. She considered this with great seriousness. You are not very good at it. Eli sighed. No. He turned back to the projection and began reorganizing the data layers, pulling the timeline readings forward and letting the emotional field measurements settle into the background. Lyran watched his hands as he worked, tracking each gesture with that particular attentiveness of hers. Tell me about Earth, she said. He glanced at her. Earth. Yes? Eli leaned back slightly against the edge of the platform. Well, Earth is significantly less elegant than this. Do your plants listen? He blinked. Our plants mostly mind their own business. That sounds boring. Sometimes they try to kill us, he added. Lyran straightened immediately. That is better. Carnivorous plants, poisonous vines, trees that drop fruit the approximate size of a small meteorite. He shrugged. Builds character. She looked delighted. Your planet sounds dangerous. It builds character, he said again more firmly. She moved closer to the projection and began examining the comparative neural structures with the focused expression of someone who had already decided she would understand this and was simply processing the specifics. Eli watched her for a moment. 9 years old, and she stood with the gravity of someone twice that. The stillness of someone who had learned early and completely that the world did not reward movement. A quiet chime moved through the laboratory. The ambient lighting shifted slightly, just a fraction warmer. Eli glanced toward the entrance corridor and stopped. Queen Maris stood at the threshold. She had entered so quietly that no one had noticed. The researchers straightened instantly and bowed their heads. Eli turned and offered a slightly awkward approximation of a nod. Your Majesty. Dr. Voss. Her gaze moved from him to Lyran, who had rolled onto her back on the analysis platform at some point in the last 30 seconds, and was now examining the neural projection from upside down. Mother, Lyran said calmly without looking over. His brain is broken. Eli closed his eyes briefly. Scientifically misrepresented, he said. The Queen stepped into the laboratory, slowly. She examined the holographic neural display with a careful attention that reminded Eli uncomfortably of the way Lyran had examined it. The same precision, the same quality of collecting rather than simply seeing. This is the emotional structure of your species, she said. Yes? She studied the tangled red signals for several seconds. It appears unstable. That is the polite word for it. The Queen tilted her head slightly. just slightly. And yet my daughter finds it comforting. Eli shrugged. My working theory is that Calendrians are accustomed to emotional signals that are careful and subtle. Compared to that, a human probably feels like standing next to a lit lantern in a very dark room. He paused. You can complain about the light, but it makes it easier to see. Lyran sat up. Yes, she pointed at Eli. That, he pointed back. Peer-reviewed confirmation. The queen looked between them. Something moved in her expression, small, controlled immediately. You make jokes, she said while explaining neuroscience. Yes, Eli said. That part is cultural. Lyran slid off the platform and drifted over to Eli's side. She did not reach for him this time, just stood close. Tell her the gravity story, she said. Eli frowned. What gravity story? Lyran looked at her mother. He activated the training field and floated into the ceiling. The queen raised one eyebrow. Eli looked at the ceiling, then back at Maris. It turns out Calendrian gravity calibration fields are extremely sensitive to unfamiliar biometric signatures. This is documented. It is in my research notes, under unexpected variables. Lyran raised both arms and demonstrated lifting slowly onto her toes with the expression of a person depicting someone drifting helplessly through the air. You said this is not ideal, she said. One of the observing scholars choked on a sound. Eli pointed toward the ceiling with great dignity. Scientific curiosity was involved. The queen looked up briefly, then back at him. Your species cannot navigate local gravity. Not without machinery, correct. That seems inconvenient. It is one of several flaws, he said. Lyran tugged his sleeve. You should try again. No. Yes. No. She smiled. He looked at the ceiling. She smiled wider. Maybe, he said, against his better judgment. Lyran looked triumphant. Queen Maris watched the exchange. For several seconds she said nothing. Then quietly, Lyran. Yes, mother. You have spent 3 days following Dr. Voss through the research wing. Yes. The queen paused. You have not done that with anyone else. Lyran thought about this with the deliberate seriousness she applied to most things. Others are quiet, she said finally. Quiet in the way that means they are hiding something. He is loud in the way that means he is not. Eli folded his arms and looked at the projection. The queen looked at him too. He suddenly found the comparative neural diagrams extremely interesting. He feels safe, Lyran said. She said it the way she said most things. Simply. Directly. As though it were a data point rather than a confession. The words landed in the laboratory chamber like a small stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward. Even the researchers nearest the wall seemed to feel them. Nobody spoke. Eli watched the neural projections spin slowly in the air. He thought about what to say and found for probably the first time in his professional life that he had nothing. Queen Maris remained perfectly still. Her gaze rested on her daughter. On the way, Lyran stood beside the human scientist, with her shoulders slightly lower than they had been in the court. The faint openness in her face that had not been there 3 days ago. Then she looked at Eli. Her expression gave him nothing to work with, which he was beginning to understand was itself a kind of information. Dr. Voss, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. You may continue your research here. Eli blinked. That was already my plan. Good. She held his gaze for one moment more. Then she turned toward the corridor. Lyran, do not let him near the gravity calibration equipment unsupervised. I will supervise, Lyran said immediately. Eli looked at the ceiling, then at the door where the queen had been standing. She was gone. She had moved that quietly. He had not heard her leave. He stood there for a moment in the warm amber light of the laboratory, the neural projections rotating slowly around him. Lyran already back at the holographic display and examining the human emotional pathways with the focused interest of someone taking very detailed notes. He thought about what Lyran had said. He feels safe. Eli picked up his data prism, turned it over in his hands. Thought about how long it had been since anyone had said that about him, including himself. He set the prism down, pulled up his research journal, typed day 3. Lyran laughed. The queen almost did. Almost is still something. Then he went back to work. Outside the glass dome, the sky of Calindra turned slowly toward evening. The orbital rings caught the last light and held it turning gold at the edges. The laboratory hummed quietly around him. Lyran asked 3 more questions about carnivorous plants and one very detailed question about whether Earth gravity would make her feel heavier or lighter than she was here. It would make her feel lighter, he told her. She considered this with great seriousness. Good, she said. I think I would like that. Eli looked at her for a moment, then back at his research notes. He added 1 more line. She said she would like to feel lighter. I think she has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. The laboratory kept humming. The projections kept turning. And somewhere in the palace in a corridor Eli had not yet walked down, a door was closed very quietly by a woman who had not allowed herself to feel anything uncontrolled in 3 years, and who had just without planning to felt something. Part 2. The cost of being heard. The investigation began quietly. That was the thing about Lord Davencor's. He did not announce himself. He did not storm into the research wing with accusations and guards and formal declarations of concern. He simply began asking questions, careful questions, the kind that arrived wrapped in politeness and left something cold behind them. Eli noticed on day 5, a researcher who had been openly friendly suddenly found reasons to work on the opposite side of the laboratory. A second one stopped coming altogether. The palace archivist who had offered to pull historical records on Calindrian empathic development sent a very polite message saying the files were temporarily restricted. Pending review. Pending review. Eli stared at that message for a long time. Then he looked across the laboratory at Lyran, who was lying on her stomach on the analysis platform, feet swinging in the air, completely absorbed in a holographic model of the human cardiovascular system. Did you know, she said, not looking up, that your heart does not beat at a consistent rhythm? Yes. That seems like a design flaw. We have several. She poked one finger through the hologram. The projected heart flickered and reorganized around her hand. But it still works. Mostly, Eli said. Lyran considered this. Maybe that is the point. Eli looked back at the message on his screen. Pending review. He closed it. He told himself it was nothing. He was a foreign researcher in a royal palace on a planet that had experienced political trauma. Of course there was oversight. Of course someone was watching. That was normal. That was reasonable. Except it did not feel like oversight. It felt like a door being quietly locked from the outside while he was still inside. Lord Davencor's was not what Eli had expected. He had expected someone openly hostile, someone with sharp eyes and sharper words and an agenda worn visibly. That was how bureaucratic opposition usually looked in Eli's experience. Obvious, declared. Kors was none of those things. He was tall, unhurried, with the stillness of a man who had learned long ago that patience was more effective than force. His robes were deep gray. His voice was measured. His face carried the expression of someone who believed genuinely and completely that he was acting in the best interests of the people he served, which made him considerably more dangerous than someone who was simply angry. He appeared at the research wing on day 5 at precisely mid-morning. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He simply entered and stood near the doorway and observed the laboratory with the expression of a man conducting a very thorough inventory. Eli kept working. Lyran looked up registered Kors and looked back at her hologram. Lord Kors, Eli said without turning around. Dr. Voss. A pause. I hope the research is progressing well. It is, thank you. Excellent. Another pause. Kors moved slightly into the room, his footsteps almost silent. Her Highness seems to find the work engaging. She has good instincts, Eli said. Yes. The word landed differently than its neighbors. Kors looked at Lyran for a moment, then at the space between Lyran and Eli, then at Eli again. She does. He stayed for 11 minutes. He asked 4 questions, all of them about methodology, all of them entirely reasonable. Then he left. Eli watched the empty doorway for a moment. Lyran said without looking up, He does not trust you. I know. He is afraid. Eli turned to look at her. Of what? She pressed her lips together thoughtfully. Things he cannot predict. Eli looked at the doorway again. He thought, yes, that is exactly it. The hollow models came down on day 6. Not all of them, just the ones Eli had requested from the Calendrian Neural Archive. The request was denied, politely, with a reference number and a time frame for appeal that suggested the appeal would arrive approximately never. Eli stood in the corridor outside the archive interface and did the math. Someone with authority was moving pieces. Quietly, methodically, closing doors without making noise about it, which was worse than making noise because at least noise could be argued with. He went back to the laboratory. Lyran was not there, which was unusual. In 6 days, she had appeared in the research wing every morning with the reliability of sunrise, usually before Eli had finished his first cup of whatever the palace kitchen considered a reasonable approximation of coffee. He sat down at his workstation. He opened his research journal. He stared at the blank entry for day 6 for a long time. Then he wrote, "Something is happening. I don't know the shape of it yet, but I can feel it the way you feel weather changing. Not the rain, just the pressure." Lyran appeared an hour later. She was quieter than usual. She sat at the edge of the analysis platform and watched the neural projections without asking questions. Eli did not push. He had learned in 6 days that Lyran's silences had different textures. Some of them were simply thought. Some of them were something older and heavier. This one was the second kind. "Did something happen?" he asked finally. She was quiet for a moment. "Then Lord Kor spoke with my mother." Eli set down his stylus. "Ah," he said. "He said." She stopped, started again. "He said that your presence is creating an instability in the palace's political structure." Eli folded his hands on the desk. "He's not entirely wrong." Lyran looked at him. "He said you are using me." The laboratory was very quiet. "What do you think?" Eli asked. She considered him with the focused attention he had come to recognize. That careful, searching quality, like she was reading something written in a language most people couldn't see. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are the first person who ever made me feel like being quiet was a choice, not a requirement." Eli did not say anything for a moment. "That," he said finally, "is the kindest thing anyone has ever said about me. It is simply true. Still." She looked back at the projection. He looked at his research notes. Outside the dome, the sky was deep violet moving toward the blue-gray of Calendra's midday. Traffic moved in organized streams far above them. Everything looked orderly from here. Everything looked like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The formal session of the High Advisory Council convened on day 7. No one told Eli directly. He found out because Lyran did not appear in the research wing that morning, and then a palace official arrived at the door with the specific expression of someone delivering news they had not volunteered to deliver. The council required his attendance. For a review, Eli put on his best research jacket, straightened his collar, looked at his reflection in the crystal wall of the corridor. "Well," he said quietly. The drone floated near his shoulder. "Respiratory irregularity detected." "Yes," Eli said. "I know." The council chamber was smaller than the Hall of Residence, but more deliberately intimidating. Where the Great Hall used scale to diminish, this room used precision. The oval table floated in its center, its surface displaying quietly shifting data constellations. The chairs arranged around it held ministers and advisors and 2 representatives from neighboring systems who had arrived the previous day for the diplomatic summit. Ambassador Queln sat among them. His violet-patterned skin caught the light. He watched Eli enter with the careful, neutral attention of someone who had spent a long career learning to observe without revealing the observation. Maris sat at the head of the table. She looked at Eli once when he entered. Then she looked at the table surface and did not look at him again. Lord Davenport stood. He waited until Eli had taken the seat indicated at the table's far end. Waited until the room had settled into its particular listening silence. Then he placed a data panel on the table surface and let the information it contained project into the air above the group. Eli's professional history, his publication record, his grant history, his institutional affiliations, and then, below all of that, his personal record. 2 years ago, Kors said, his voice level and measured. Dr. Voss experienced a significant personal loss. His younger sister was killed in a transport accident in the Veyan corridor. Following that event, his research focus shifted substantially, from broad xenobiological survey work to a highly specific concentration on emotional recovery after collective trauma. The room listened. Eli listened too. Dr. Voss arrived on Kalindra presenting this research as academic. Kors continued. But the record suggests something more personal. He is not simply studying how species recover from loss. He is searching for answers he has not been able to find for himself. Kors looked at Eli directly. His expression was not cruel. That was the part that made it difficult. His expression was that of a man who believed completely that what he was doing was protection. In that context, Kors said his connection with Princess Lyran takes on a different character. He did not come here to help us. He came here to find something for himself. And our princess, in her vulnerability, has become the means by which he is attempting to do that. The room was very quiet. Every eye at the table turned toward Eli, including finally Maris. Her expression gave him nothing, but she was looking at him now, waiting, the way the entire room was waiting. Eli looked at the data projection hovering above the table, at his sister's name in the accident report, at the date, at the shift in his research record that followed it, which was visible and undeniable, and exactly as Kors had described it. He thought about arguing. He thought about explaining the distinction between personal motivation and professional conduct, about how the fact that he was broken did not automatically mean his work was broken, about how being wounded and being manipulative were not the same thing. He thought about all of it, and then he set it aside. Because Kors was right. Not entirely, not in the way Kors meant it, but right enough that denying it would be dishonest. And Eli was at his most fundamental level constitutionally incapable of being dishonest in a way that would hold up under examination, which was, he recognized dimly, probably the same quality that made Lyran feel safe standing next to him. He straightened in his chair. "He's right," Eli said. The room shifted. Kors blinked, just slightly. "I came here broken," Eli said. His voice was steady, not loud, just clear. "My sister died 2 years ago, and I spent the year after it trying to understand something that kept not making sense to me. How do you come back from something like that? How do other people do it? How do entire civilizations do it? Because at least if I could understand the large scale, maybe the small scale would start to make sense." He paused. "So, yes, my research is personal. It has always been personal. I am not going to apologize for that because every significant piece of scientific work is personal at its core. The question is not why I came here. The question is whether what I have done here has caused harm." Kors opened his mouth. Eli kept going. "Your princess has not spoken willingly to another person in 3 years. In 6 days, she has laughed more times than I can count. She has asked questions. She has been curious about things outside the palace walls. She has, by every observable measure, been more present in her own life than she has been since the attack that killed her father." He looked at Kors directly. "I did not plan that. I did not engineer it. It happened because I was honest with her, and because I did not try to be quiet when quietness was not what she needed." A pause. "Broken things," Eli said, "sometimes know how to find each other." The room was silent for a long moment. Queln at his end of the table tilted his head very slightly. One of the ministers looked at the table surface. Kors looked at Eli with an expression that had shifted somewhere between frustration and something more complicated. Something that was almost but not quite respect in Maris. Maris looked at him with an expression Eli could not read at all. It was not the queen's face she was wearing. Not the composed political architecture she carried in the hall, in the corridors, and every public space she occupied. It was something underneath that, something that had not decided yet what it was going to become. She looked at him for 3 seconds, then she looked away. Kors spoke again, calmly, with the patience of a man who had not finished. "The concern is not only with the princess," he said. "Dr. Voss's influence on this palace has moved beyond a single relationship. The atmosphere of the research wing has changed. The staff have become informal. The patterns of interaction have shifted in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to observe. He paused. And there are those who feel that Her Majesty herself has become. Another pause. Distracted. The word landed with very specific weight. Maris did not move. Kors kept his eyes on the table surface. I raise this not as an accusation, but as a concern that I believe deserves consideration. The room waited, and then Maris spoke. The session is concluded, she said. Her voice was completely level. I will consider the concerns raised and respond to the council before the diplomatic summit concludes. She stood. Everyone stood. She walked out of the chamber. And Eli, sitting at the far end of the floating table, understood that something had just been decided. He did not know what yet, but the air in the room had changed, the way air changes when a door closes somewhere you cannot see. The order came 2 hours later. A palace official, different from the one that morning. This one had the expression of someone who had been specifically selected for their ability to deliver difficult information without revealing any personal feeling about it. Dr. Voss was to prepare for departure. A transport would be arranged within 24 hours. Eli stood in the doorway of the research wing and read the formal notice. Then he folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, walked back to the laboratory. Lyran was there. She had returned while he was in the council session. She was sitting at the edge of the analysis platform, not looking at the neural projections, not examining anything, just sitting. Her feet did not swing. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had the stillness of someone who was waiting for something they already knew was coming. Eli sat down beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You have to go, she said finally. It was not a question. Yes. Lyran looked at the floor, at the pale stone of the platform, the faint glow of the gravitic field that kept it suspended. Because of Lord Kors. Because of several things. Because my mother is afraid. Eli looked at her. Why do you say that because? She paused, chose her words with the deliberate care she always used. She has that face, the one she had after my father died, when she decided that if she did not let anything in, nothing could hurt us anymore. The laboratory was very quiet. Eli thought about several things he could say, several versions of reassurance, several ways of framing the situation that would make it feel smaller or more manageable or less like what it actually was. He discarded all of them. I need to say goodbye, he said instead. Lyran nodded once, and then she did something Eli did not expect. She stood up. She walked to the nearest holographic display, the one containing the neural comparison models, the one she had spent 6 days examining and questioning and occasionally arguing with. She reached up and pressed her hand flat against the side of the projector. The display went dark. She moved to the next one. Dark. And the next. Dark. One by one. Each screen, each projection, each hovering model that had lit the research wing in soft color for the past 6 days. She moved through the laboratory with the quiet deliberateness of someone performing a ritual they had done before, had done many times before. And with each screen that went dark, Eli understood something he had not understood before. This was not new behavior. This was practiced behavior. She had learned to do this somewhere, in some other room, in some other moment of loss. She had learned to take the light and turn it off herself before anyone else could take it from her. She reached the last display. The room was almost completely dark. She pressed her hand against the final projector, and then she sat down on the floor in the dark with her knees drawn up and her face turned toward the wall, and she did not say a single word. Eli stood at the edge of the room. He looked at her. He thought about leaving. The transport would be arranged. The council had decided. The queen had decided. The appropriate thing was to go back to his quarters and pack his equipment and let the palace return to whatever it had been before he arrived. He thought about the girl sitting in the dark, about the pattern of it, the way she had moved through the room, methodical and quiet, turning out every light, as though she had done it so many times that grief had its own choreography now, as though she had learned somewhere that darkness was simply what you sat in when someone left. Eli pulled a chair from the nearest workstation, carried it to the center of the dark room. sat down, in the dark, near her, not touching, not speaking, just there. Lyran did not move for a long moment. Then very quietly, "What are you doing sitting?" Eli said. "You are supposed to leave." "I know." "Then why?" "Because he said nobody should sit in the dark alone." Lyran was quiet. The laboratory hummed around them, the gravitic fields of the floating platforms, doing their quiet work, the crystal walls dim without the projections to feed them color. Outside the dome, Kalindra's night sky was beginning to show at the edges violet, giving way to deep blue at the horizon. "She is afraid of losing someone again," Lyran said finally. Her voice was very small. "I know. She thinks if she does not let people stay, they cannot leave." "Yes. But they leave anyway." A pause. "They leave anyway, and you just did not get to have them while they were here." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly right." Lyran pulled her knees slightly closer to her chest. "Did your sister leave like that? Suddenly?" "Yes." "Did it make sense afterward?" "No," Eli said honestly. "It still doesn't." "How do you keep working?" she asked, "if it does not make sense?" Eli thought about that for a long time. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes the working is the only thing that makes it feel like the loss meant something. Like if I can understand it well enough, maybe it becomes, not smaller, but part of something larger." Lyran was quiet. "Then I think that is why you feel safe." He looked at her in the dark. She was barely visible. Just the pale outline of her, the faint glow of the reactive fibers in her tunic. "Because you are not pretending," she said. "You are not trying to feel a different way than you feel. You just feel it. And keep going." Eli did not say anything. Because there was nothing to say. Because she was 9 years old and she had just described something it had taken him 2 years to partially understand. They sat in the dark for a long time. And then, because he had not planned to, because it was not strategic or calculated or part of any design, Eli said, "I'm going to ask your mother for one more conversation before I go." Lyran looked at him. He could not see her expression clearly in the dark. But her voice when she spoke was different. Careful. Specific in the way she was when something mattered. "Why?" she asked. "Because Eli said there is something she needs to hear, and I don't think anyone else is going to say it." Lyran was quiet for a moment. "She might not listen. She might not," he agreed. "She is very stubborn. I have noticed. You are also stubborn." Eli considered this. "I prefer determined." Lyran made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Something adjacent to one. Something that had the shape of a laugh and was deciding whether to become one. "You should bring the drone," she said. Eli frowned. "Why?" "Because it translates casserole as ceremonial grief pudding." She almost laughed at that. "In the council session." A pause. "I was watching from the corridor." Eli stared at the dark space where she was sitting. "You were in the corridor." "I wanted to hear." "Lyran." "You did well," she said, matter of fact. "You told the truth, even the part that was difficult." Eli rubbed the back of his neck. "It is a habit. I know." She uncurled slightly. Her feet found the floor. "That is why I am telling you to go talk to her. Because you will tell the truth even when it is difficult. And she has not had that in a very long time." Eli looked at the dark room around them, at the turned-off screens and the dimmed crystal walls, and the quiet hum of the gravitic fields holding everything gently in place. He thought about his sister. He thought about 2 years of research and questions and the particular exhaustion of trying to understand something that resisted understanding. He thought about a girl who had turned off every light in a room and sat in the dark because she had learned somewhere that was what you did. He stood up. "Turn the lights back on," he said gently. Lyran looked at him. "Please," he added. She considered this for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to the nearest projector, pressed her hand against it. The neural model bloomed back into the air, soft blue and complicated red overlapping in their imperfect searching way. She moved to the next one, and the next. Light by light, the laboratory came back. By the time she reached the last screen, the room was warm again. Color in the crystal walls. The drone rotating quietly near the workstation. The models turning in their patient loops. Lyran looked at the human brain projection for a moment. Broken radio, she said quietly. Yes. She looked at him. Go fix something. Eli picked up his research jacket from the back of the chair, straightened his collar, looked at the drone. Come on. The drone rotated, followed him toward the door. Behind him, he heard Lyran sit back on the analysis platform, the soft sound of her settling in, the way the gravitic field adjusted slightly to her weight. He did not look back. But he thought I came here to study how people find their way back from loss. And then I had no idea the lesson was going to be this expensive. He walked out into the corridor. The palace stretched ahead of him, its living walls glowing with quiet data, its air perfectly calibrated, its every surface adjusted for comfort and precision, and the very specific kind of beauty that belonged to people who had learned to make grief look like architecture. Eli walked through it toward the Queen's private corridor. The drone floated beside him. Respiratory irregularity, it noted. Yes, Eli said. I know. He kept walking. Part 3. What the hall remembers. The corridor outside the Queen's private wing was empty, which made sense. It was late. The palace had settled into its evening rhythms. The living walls dimmed to a softer luminescence. The data streams in the crystal surfaces moving more slowly, like the whole structure was breathing down toward sleep. Even the gravitic hum of the floating platforms felt quieter at this hour, more patient. Eli stood outside the door for longer than he needed to. The drone waited beside him. He was composing things in his head, arguments, frameworks, careful logical presentations of why the decision to send him away was understandable, but ultimately counterproductive. He had several versions. Some of them were quite good. One of them included a graph. He discarded all of them, because he wasn't here to win an argument. He wasn't even here to change her mind. He was here because a 9-year-old girl had sat in a dark room and turned off every light and described grief with a precision that had taken his breath away. And because someone needed to say a particular thing to Queen Maris Solvin that no one else in this palace was going to say. He knocked. Silence, then, enter. The room was not what he expected. He had braced for something formal. The architectural authority of the throne room scaled down to private dimensions, symbols of power carefully arranged to remind visitors of exactly where they stood. Instead, he found books. Real ones, the kind with physical pages stacked on floating shelves that curved along one wall. A desk covered in actual paper documents, handwritten the Calendrian script, flowing across them in pale ink. A single large window looking out over the night garden where the bioluminescent plants had shifted to their evening colors, soft gold and deep blue, moving gently in the climate-controlled air. Myra stood at the window. She did not turn when he entered. You were not supposed to come here, she said. No, Eli agreed. The order was clear. It was. And yet, he said. She turned then. She had changed out of the ceremonial layers she wore in the council chamber. What she wore now was simpler. Still elegant because apparently elegance was structural for her rather than chosen but simpler. Her pale hair was partially unbound, a few strands loose around her face. She looked for the first time since Eli had arrived on Calendra like a person rather than a position, which somehow made her harder to face, not easier. Say what you came to say, she said. Not unkind, just direct. The way people are direct when they are very tired. Eli put his hands in his pockets. When was the last time, he said, you let yourself be afraid in front of someone? Maris looked at him. The silence stretched. That, she said finally, is not a question I expected. No, I don't imagine it is. She turned back to the window. Outside, the garden glowed in its quiet evening colors. A small automated drone moved between the plants, checking moisture levels, maintaining the precise environmental balance that kept everything alive. I am afraid every day, she said. That is the nature of this position. I'm not talking about the position, Eli said. I'm talking about you. Another silence. Longer. Dr. Voss? Eli. She paused. Eli. The word landed differently than his title, like she was testing its weight. What you are asking is not a question I have the latitude to answer. I know, he said. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him over her shoulder. Why? Because Lyran told me something tonight. He kept his voice level. She told me that when she turned off the lights in the research lab, which she did every one of them one by one, and then sat in the dark on the floor, she told me that wasn't new behavior. That was practice behavior. A pause. She's done it before, somewhere, in some other moment when someone left or something ended. She's done it enough that she has a system for it now. Maris had gone very still. And I realized Eli said that a 9-year-old doesn't develop a system for sitting alone in the dark unless she has had enough practice to refine it. The room was quiet, just the faint hum of the palace, the soft movement of the garden outside, the drone's respiratory irregularity warning, which Eli silenced with a sharp look. She was in the room, Maris said. Her voice had changed, something underneath the control, like a fracture in glass that hasn't spread yet. The night Aldrin died, she was supposed to be asleep. She came to find me, and I didn't know she was there until... She stopped. Eli waited. I had already another stop. The queen of a star system trying to finish a sentence in a private room with a human scientist and finding apparently that some sentences were not built to be finished easily. She saw me. Before I could... A breath. Before I could put myself back together. Eli said nothing. She was 6 years old, Maris said, and she saw her mother fall apart on the floor of the council anteroom because the man who had kept her standing for 11 years was gone, and there was nothing left to hold the shape of the grief. The window held the garden's soft light. The plants moved gently. After that, Maris continued, I decided that she would not see that again, that I would be what she needed. Stable, certain, present without being, without showing. She paused. I thought I was protecting her. I know, Eli said. I thought if she saw that I was still standing, still functioning, still governing, then she would understand that survival was possible. I know, he said again, but she went quiet. The words were barely above a conversational volume and they carried everything. She went quiet and I told myself she was grieving, that it was natural, that she would come back. But she didn't come back, and I didn't know how to... A pause. I didn't know what I had taught her. Eli crossed the room. Not all the way, just enough. He stopped several feet away and stood there, and the proximity was deliberate, not to intrude, but to make himself real. To make the conversation real rather than something she could seal off behind the architecture of authority. You taught her, he said quietly, that strength means not letting anyone see you break. So she learned not to break, or at least not to break anywhere visible. And then she had nowhere to put it, and the nowhere became silence. Maris looked at him, not the filing look, not the measuring look, something else, something that had come up from underneath the other looks and was not entirely under control. She didn't go quiet because she lost her father, Eli said. She went quiet because she thought that was what strength looked like. She learned it from you. A very long silence. Outside, one of the garden drones completed its circuit and paused near a cluster of gold-leaf plants that were cycling toward their midnight bloom. The petals opened slowly, bioluminescent, patient. I know, Maris said. It was 2 words, but the way she said them. Eli had heard confessions before. Scientific confessions, the kind where a researcher admitted the data didn't support the hypothesis. Personal ones, the kind that arrived in late-night messages or across tables in questionable restaurants on 3 different planets. He had heard people say, I know while, meaning I didn't know, I refused to know I knew and looked away. This was not any of those. This was someone who had arrived at the truth through a long, unlit corridor and was standing at the end of it, now not running from it. She laughed, Maris said. Her voice was very quiet. I heard her laughing in the research wing. Day 3. I stood outside the door and I thought something had shifted and I didn't know what to do with that because I had been so careful to build everything so that nothing could shift. And then she laughed and it was so... A pause. I had forgotten what it sounded like. Eli thought about his journal entry. Day 3. Lyran laughed. The Queen almost did. Almost is still something. He had been right about the almost. He had been wrong about it being small. She asked me. Eli said what I feel right now, the first day in the lab. She does that. She reads people and then she asks them to confirm what she's read as though she wants to give them the chance to be honest about themselves. He paused. I told her I felt mild scientific curiosity and moderate professional embarrassment, which was true. But the fuller truth was that I felt recognized, in a way I hadn't in a long time, by a child who had no reason to look at a stranger and see something worth paying attention to. Maris was looking at him with the careful attention he had come to associate with her daughter. Same eyes, different windows. Kors is not wrong, Eli said. I came here carrying something. My research is personal. It has always been personal. I was looking for something when I got on that transport. I'm not sure I knew exactly what, but I was looking. He paused. But I need you to know that I did not use your daughter. She found something in me that she needed, and I found something in her that I needed. And that is not manipulation. That is just people finding each other across the improbable distance. The room was quiet. Maris looked at the floor. Then she said, Kors came to me because he is afraid I am becoming distracted. I heard. He is not wrong about that either. Eli was very still. You are unusually honest, Maris said. It is inconvenient. I have been told that. You cannot control your emotional signals, which means I cannot predict what I am perceiving when I am near you. She said this with the careful precision of someone reporting data. It is disconcerting. I apologize for my nervous system. Don't, she looked at him. I said disconcerting, not unwelcome. Eli's brain did the thing it occasionally did, where it processed a piece of information and then immediately questioned whether it had processed it correctly. He decided not to say anything. Wisdom, probably. The order stands, Maris said. You leave tomorrow morning. Eli nodded. But, she turned back to the window. I will speak with Kors tonight, before the final summit session. Eli looked at her profile, the angle of her jaw, the way the garden light came through the window and caught in her pale hair. What will you say, he asked. I don't know yet. A pause. Something true. Apparently that is what is required. She glanced at him sideways. You are a bad influence. I have been told that too. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, the geometry of one. Go back to your quarters, Dr. Voss, she said. Get some sleep. Eli backed toward the door. Eli, he said. She looked at him. You keep calling me Dr. Voss. My name is Eli. Maris regarded him for a moment. Go to sleep, Eli, she said. He went. The transport was scheduled for mid-morning. Eli stood in his quarters at dawn and packed with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned across years of field research on several planets how to leave a place quickly. Data cores, research journals, the drone hovering near the window and watching the garden with what appeared to be mild melancholy. You don't have feelings, Eli told it. Correct, the drone agreed. Then stop looking sad. The drone rotated once and returned to neutral hovering. Eli folded his last jacket. He thought about Lyran, about leaving without seeing her. That had been his plan. Clean departure, no drawn-out goodbyes. Those were the worst kind. He had extensive personal evidence. He closed his bag. He looked at the room, at the pale walls and the floating shelf, and the view of the garden where the midnight bloom plants were closing now, pulling back into themselves in the morning light, saving their color for the dark again. He picked up his bag, walked out. The morning summit session of the High Advisory Council convened at the 9th hour. Eli knew because the official notice had specified it. He also knew because the palace had a quality of purposeful movement during formal sessions, people walking with the directional certainty of people who knew where they needed to be. He was not supposed to attend. He was supposed to be at the transport bay. He went to the council chamber. He stood outside it for approximately 30 seconds, having a very clear internal conversation about choices and consequences and the definition of following instructions. Then he went in. The chamber was arranged as it had been the day before. Floating table, data constellation surface, ministers and advisors in their appointed seats. Ambassador Queln at his end, his violet-patterned skin catching the light, his expression, its customary careful neutral. Kors stood near the head of the table. Maris had not yet entered. Kors looked at Eli when he came in. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like someone updating a calculation they had already been running. "Dr. Voss," he said, "your transport issue has not left yet," Eli said pleasantly. I checked. He sat down in the same seat he had occupied the day before. The council exchanged glances. Eli folded his hands on the table surface and waited. The door at the head of the chamber opened. Maris entered. She was in full ceremonial dress. The formal layers, the braided silver threads in her hair, the posture that carried centuries of inherited authority without appearing to carry anything at all. She looked at Eli. She did not look surprised. She looked at Kors. Something passed between them, the look of two people who have said something difficult in private and are now in public together for the first time since. Kors inclined his head, small but visible. Myris took her seat. "The final session of the diplomatic summit," she said, "will address the proposed terms of the research exchange program between the Kalendrian system and the Talon Confederacy. Ambassador Queln." Queln leaned slightly forward. "Your Majesty, our primary interest remains in the area of xenoneurological mapping. We believe a formal exchange of researchers and methodology could benefit both systems significantly." He paused. "We have observed during our time here a particular application of that research, which has been instructive." His gaze moved briefly to Eli. Eli gave him a small nod. Kors straightened slightly. "The Council has concerns regarding external research presence in sensitive political periods. These concerns were raised formally yesterday and remain under consideration." "Yes," Maris said. A pause. "I have considered them." The room was very quiet. "Lord Kors's concerns are valid," Maris said. Her voice was level, measured, the full formal register. "His responsibility is the stability of this court and the protection of the royal family. He has exercised that responsibility faithfully." Kors looked at her. "And he is right," she continued, "that the presence of Dr. Voss has changed this palace." Nobody moved. "My daughter has not laughed in 3 years." She said it to the table, to the assembled council, to no one and everyone simultaneously. She stopped speaking willingly after her father's death. She withdrew from her tutors, from her guardians, from the household staff who had known her since birth. A pause. "From me." The room was still. "I told myself this was grief," Maris said. "I told myself she would come back when she was ready. I told myself I was giving her space and time and the resources she needed to heal." Another pause. "I did not tell myself the part that was true, that she had watched me choose silence after Aldrin died, and she had learned from that choice, that she had decided because I had decided that silence was what strength required." Kors was looking at the table surface. Queln was very still. "My daughter did not go quiet because she lost her father," Maris said. "She went quiet because she thought that was what it looked like to survive. She learned it from me." She looked up, at the council, at Kors, at Queln, at Eli last. "Dr. Voss did not heal her," she said. "He was simply the first person she encountered who was constitutionally incapable of being quiet in the way she had learned to expect. And in that, she found something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking." She placed both hands flat on the table. "He showed me what I had done, and he gave me the language to understand it. That is not manipulation. That is not a security risk. That is what it looks like when someone tells you a true thing you needed to hear." Kors raised his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said. "Davin!" Her voice shifted. Not softer exactly, more human. The voice from last night, not the voice of the throne. "You have protected this family for 11 years. You kept the court functioning when I could barely speak. You made decisions I could not make. You have been faithful in ways that I have never adequately acknowledged. Kors was very still. And your concern for Lyran is real, she said. And your concern for me is real. I know that. I have always known that. A pause. But you cannot protect us from connection, she said. You can only protect us from threats. And those are not the same thing. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Kors looked at the table, and then slowly he inclined his head. Not a small nod, a full bow of the head, the kind that meant something. Your Majesty, he said, and said nothing else. Maris straightened. Dr. Eli Voss will remain on Kylindra, she said in the full formal voice, now the one that entered the Crystal Pillar records and became living memory. As scientific advisor to the Royal Research Wing, with full diplomatic protections and the formal hospitality of the Crown. She looked at Eli. If he accepts. Eli sat at the far end of the floating table. He thought about his transport. He thought about the research journal in his bag, about the entries from the last 8 days, about day 3 and the laughing, about the dark room and the turned-off screens, about a corridor outside a private chamber where he had stood for longer than necessary composing arguments he had decided not to use. He thought about his sister, about the 2 years since, about the work that had felt on its best days like a way of making the loss mean something. Like if he could understand grief well enough at a large enough scale, maybe the small scale would make sense. He thought about and almost smiled at a window. He thought I came here to study how people find their way back from loss. He thought I had no idea I was one of them. Yes, he said. The drone translated it. One of the ministers let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time. Queln smiled, the first fully open smile Eli had seen from him. It suited the man considerably. Kors did not smile, but the set of his shoulders changed. The way a room changes when a window is open somewhere you can't see. Something shifted in the pressure of him, just slightly. But it was there. Maris looked at the data constellation on the table surface. Something in her expression was different now. Not uncontrolled because that was not something Maris Solvin permitted in public spaces, but present in a way that was distinct from the composed authority she wore like architecture. She looked like someone who had made a decision they had been afraid to make and found on the other side of it that the ground was still there. The session moved toward its formal close. Queln crossed to speak with one of the Calendrian ministers. 2 advisors conferred quietly over a trade document. The particular organized movement of a formal gathering releasing into informal momentum. Eli stood up and then heard the sound. Small feet, moving fast, which was apparently not something that happened in palace corridors because 2 guards immediately reached for their ceremonial spears and then immediately relaxed when they identified the source. Princess Lyran came through the chamber doorway at approximately full speed, her pale ceremonial tunic glimmering with movement, her long ears catching the light, her face wearing an expression Eli had not yet seen on it. Pure, uncomplicated. Relief. She stopped when she saw him, just for a second. Then she covered the remaining distance between them and threw her arms around him for the second time in 8 days, and significantly fewer people reached for weapons about it this time. Eli put his arms around her. You are staying, she said into his jacket. Yes. I heard through the door. Of course you did. Lord Kors looked like he needed to sit down. He was quite composed, actually. His left ear was twitching. She pulled back slightly to look up at him. I notice things. I am aware. She kept one hand gripping his jacket, an anchor the way she always did. Then she turned still, holding on, and looked at her mother. Maris had crossed the chamber. She stood a few feet away, full formal dress, silver threads, the bearing of someone who had governed an interstellar system for 11 years and intended to continue doing so. And her daughter was looking at her, not through her, not past her, at her, with the clear searching attention that Lyran gave to things she was genuinely trying to understand. Mother, she said, Lyran, are you afraid right now? The chamber had not entirely cleared. Several people within earshot went carefully still. Myris looked at her daughter. Yes, she said. Lyran considered this. Of what? Of. A pause. Getting this wrong. Lyran thought about that for a moment. Then she reached out her other hand, the one not holding Eli's jacket. She held it out to her mother. Open, waiting, patient the way she was patient when she had decided something and was simply giving the universe time to catch up. Myris looked at the small, outstretched hand. For a moment, she was the queen. Composed, architectural, the product of 11 years of learning to hold the shape of grief. And then she took her daughter's hand. Lyran pulled them both forward. Eli and Maris, one on each side until the three of them stood together in the center of the council chamber with Lyran between them, holding on to both. And she looked up, first at Eli, then at her mother. Humans say families should hug, she announced loudly enough for the nearest crystal recording surface to capture it. Eli looked at the ceiling. I said that once, he told it. You said it twice, Lyran corrected. Once in the lab and once when you were floating. I was disoriented when I was floating. You were very sincere. Myris looked at Eli over the top of her daughter's head. Her expression was the one he had glimpsed last night in the private room. The underneath one. The one that hadn't decided what it was yet and was perhaps beginning to decide. Is this a standard human diplomatic practice? She asked. Absolutely not, Eli said. And yet, he agreed. Something crossed her face. Something that started very small and became less small. It moved through her eyes first, then the corner of her mouth, then it arrived fully and quietly like a window opening after a long winter. Not loud, not performed, just real. Maris Solvin, queen of the Calendrian system, ruler of 14 inhabited territories, laughed in the middle of the council chamber, in front of ministers and advisors, and Ambassador Queln, and two guards who would be describing this moment to their colleagues for years. Soft, clear, entirely genuine. Lyran looked immediately triumphant. Queln across the room smiled the open smile again. Kors near the doorway looked at the floor with an expression that was not quite peace, but was a step toward it. Eli thought, there it is. Not the almost. The actual thing. He thought about his journal. About day 3. About the line he had written in the warm amber light of the laboratory, with the projections turning slowly around him. Almost is still something. He thought I should go back and finish that sentence. Lyran looked up at both of them with the satisfied expression of someone who had completed a difficult research project and found the results exactly as predicted. Better, she said simply, and it was. Maris composed herself almost entirely, though there was something warm remaining at the edges of her expression that had not been there 8 days ago and did not appear to be going anywhere. She looked at Eli. You are, she said, an extraordinary amount of trouble. I have extensive documentation of that, Eli agreed. I imagine you do. Lyran squeezed both their hands simultaneously and looked up at the chamber around them. At the floating table, in the data constellation surface, in the crystal recording pillars that had captured everything spoken here into living memory. Is the hall next? She asked. Myris looked at her daughter. Something in her expression shifted again. Quieter this time. Deeper. Yes, she said. The hall is next. The hall of resonance looked the same, and completely different. The ceiling still arched above him like a private sky. The silver current still carried light through the dome in slow, patient waves. The crystal pillars still spiraled upward on both sides, the pale blue symbols moving across their surfaces, recording the words spoken beneath them into the memory of the palace. But the silence felt different. 8 days ago, when Eli had walked into this hall with sweating hands and 3 remaining slides and absolutely no idea what was about to happen to his afternoon, the silence had been the silence of assessment. The quiet of a room full of people deciding whether a thing was a threat or simply an inconvenience. Now it was something else entirely. It was the silence of attention, of people who had gathered because something true was going to be said here, and truth, as Maris herself had noted, was considerably more disruptive than strategy. The court had assembled, ministers in their silver layers, scholars near the crystal pillars, no longer pretending to review data, simply present, the royal guard at their posts, ceremonial spears in hand, Ambassador Queln and the diplomatic delegation along the far wall, and Kors standing to the side in his deep gray robes, his expression carrying the settled quality of a man who had processed a great deal in the last 12 hours and arrived somewhere he had not expected. Kors looked at Eli when he entered. A long, even look. The look of a man who has updated his assessment of a situation and is willing to acknowledge the update. Eli nodded at him. Kors nodded back. Small but unambiguous. Eli walked to the center of the hall, stood in the place he had stood 8 days ago exactly. His drone floated near his left shoulder. Respiratory function, it offered. Stable, Eli said. Thank you. The drone seemed almost disappointed. Queen Maris entered from the far corridor. The court arranged itself with the choreography of long practice. She walked to the dais. The throne hovered in its ring of silver light. She did not sit. She stood in front of it. 8 days ago, she said, this court witnessed something unexpected. The symbols on the pillars brightened. A stranger arrived to speak about loss and recovery. He told a joke about a casserole. A pause. The translation was imprecise. Near the scholars section, a sound was very carefully suppressed. He was loud, Maris continued. Not in his voice, in the way he moved through this hall, in the way he spoke, in the way he carried his grief without trying to make it invisible. She looked at the assembled court and then at Eli. And my daughter, who had been silent for 3 years, heard that and walked toward it. Lyran was standing beside her mother. She did not look at the court. She looked at Eli, with the expression of someone delivering a final confirmation of something they had already decided was true long before the vote was taken. What followed, Maris said, was not planned. It was not diplomatic strategy. It was not the kind of thing that appears in protocol manuals, of which we have many and which I have read all of. A pause. It was simply true. And truth, it turns out, is considerably more disruptive than strategy. The hall was completely still. I have spoken with Lord Kors, she said, and with myself, which was the more difficult conversation. Something in her voice. Not soft exactly, but human. The voice from the private room given public form. And I have understood something that required a human scientist with a malfunctioning emotional filter and a translation drone with a poor grasp of casserole to make clear to me. Eli thought, that is going on my professional record, and I have made my peace with it. My daughter did not lose her voice because she lost her father, Maris said. She lost it because she watched me choose silence and learned that this was how the strong survived. The hall held its breath. I was wrong. 3 words, in the full formal register, into the crystal pillar record, into the living memory of the palace where it would remain long after the people who heard it today were gone. I was wrong. Lyran looked at her mother, and Maris looked back. Not the queen looking at a subject, not a ruler surveying a charge. A mother looking at her daughter across the very small and very enormous distance of a truth finally spoken aloud in the right room at the right time. The hall was still for a long moment. Then Maris returned to the formal register. Her voice carried to every corner the way it always did, effortlessly, with the authority of someone who had been trained since childhood to fill large spaces with words that mattered. Dr. Eli Voss of Earth will remain on Kylindra as scientific advisor to the Royal Research Wing, with full diplomatic recognition and the formal hospitality of the Crown, for as long as he chooses to stay. She looked at him across the hall. The court is asked to extend him every courtesy. No one argued, which was, Eli thought, genuine progress. Lyran was moving before the formal words had finished settling into the pillar records. Not running exactly, something more deliberate than running and more urgent than walking. She crossed the hall floor and stopped in front of Eli and looked up at him with the focused expression of someone delivering the conclusion of a very careful, very long analysis. You stayed, she said. I stayed, even when the order said to go. The transport hadn't left yet. She gave him the look of someone who found that argument completely unconvincing and was not going to pretend otherwise. You stayed, she said again. And the third time was not a repetition. It was a statement of category, of what kind of person does a thing like that. Yes, Eli said, and she hugged him. Both arms, her face pressed against his jacket the way she had in this very hall 8 days ago, when all of this had begun. Except this time the hall did not freeze. This time the guards did not reach for their weapons. This time the scholar smiled openly, and Quell nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has observed a complicated situation resolved correctly, and even Kor, standing to the side in his deep gray robes, looked at the polished floor with an expression that had something peaceful working its way into it. Lyran turned still, holding Eli's jacket in one fist, and reached for her mother with the other hand. Myris came. She crossed the floor of the Hall of Resonance in full formal dress before the assembled court and the diplomatic delegation and the pillars that recorded everything into living memory, and she took her daughter's outstretched hand without hesitation. Lyran pulled, and the three of them stood together in the center of the hall. The researcher with the malfunctioning emotional filter, the queen who had learned to mistake silence for strength, and the child who had been quietly, patiently, stubbornly waiting for the world to remember how to be warm. Somewhere in the hall, someone laughed. Then another person. Then the wave of it moved through the chamber the way the silver light moved through the dome overhead, steady and patient, and reaching every corner without being forced. Maris looked at Eli over her daughter's head. There it was again, the warm edge of the expression, the thing underneath the authority, real and present and not being controlled away. You are, she said, an extraordinary amount of trouble. I have extensive documentation of that. Eli agreed. I imagine you do. Lyran squeezed both their hands at once. They looked down at her. She looked up at them with the deeply satisfied expression of someone who had set out to achieve a specific result and found the data exactly as predicted. Better, she said simply. Eli looked up at the dome above them, the silver currents moving through it, the soft light traveling from one end of the hall to the other in slow, patient waves the way it always had, the way it would continue to long after today became memory. He thought about his sister, about the transport that had taken her and not brought her back, about the 2 years of questions and work and the particular grief of trying to understand something that kept refusing to make sense at a personal scale, no matter how clearly he understood it at every other one. He thought about a girl who had turned off every light in a room and sat in the dark on the floor and waited because that was what she had learned to do, and about sitting down in that dark beside her because nobody should sit in the dark alone. He thought about an almost smile at a garden window and the full version of it in a council chamber a few hours later, and the way some things that start as almost become real given enough time and enough honesty. He looked at Lyran still standing between them, one hand holding his jacket and one hand holding her mother's, the reactive fibers of her tunic glimmering softly in the light of the hall. He thought, I came here to study how people find their way back from loss. He thought I found my way back. He thought, I think that counts as research. The drone floated near his shoulder. Emotional resonance, it said. A pause. Stable. The hall was warm, not from the silver currents or the carefully calibrated atmospheric systems that maintained the palace at precise environmental standards. Not from the ceremony or the formal words or the weight of the living memory being written into the crystal pillars, from the people in it. Which was, Eli thought, exactly the kind of data point that didn't fit neatly into any model he had ever built. He was going to need a new model. He was very much looking forward to building it.